Before Einstein rewrote the universe, before NASA shot for the stars, there was one man the church would have gladly launched into orbit: Galileo Galilei. A starry-eyed rebel with a telescope, a knack for mathematical mayhem, and a habit of upsetting powerful people, Galileo didn't just gaze into the heavens. He dragged Earth into modernity kicking and screaming. This is the scandal-strewn, ego-driven, borderline heretical life of the man who dared to say, "Hey, maybe we're not the center of the universe after all." Spoiler: it did not go over well. Galileo Galilei wasn't born under a comet or swaddled in star charts, but he might as well have been. From the moment he hit the cobbled streets of Pisa in 1564, same year as Shakespeare, by the way, there was something extra about him. Not noble, not rich, not even especially well-connected, but gifted with two things Renaissance Italy found both thrilling and dangerous: an absurdly quick brain and a reckless mouth. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, was no background character either. He was a music theorist, which in the 16th century meant constantly arguing with people who were way too into math and metaphysics. The Galileis weren't exactly dining with dukes, but they were intellectuals, meaning young Galileo grew up in a house where questioning authority was basically considered a personality trait. While other kids were learning their prayers, Galileo was learning that the world was full of people pretending to know more than they actually did, and he was already making a mental list of who needed to be called out. So, what do you do when your son starts pulling apart Aristotle's teachings before he hits puberty? You send him to university, obviously. At 16, Galileo entered the University of Pisa, supposedly to study medicine. But it took approximately 5 minutes for him to realize he didn't care about healing people. He cared about proving things. Why memorize the 4 bodily humors when you could spend your time figuring out why objects fall? Or why pendulums swing the way they do? Or how sound travels through air? Galileo had discovered something much more potent than a medical license: physics. Of course, abandoning your medical studies in 1580 was the Renaissance equivalent of saying, "I'm dropping out to become a YouTuber." Vincenzo was not thrilled. Galileo, however, was undeterred. He started giving private math lessons and quickly made a name for himself as that guy who was always poking holes in the classics, especially Aristotle, the ancient authority everyone else was too scared to question. Here's where it gets spicy. Galileo wasn't just smart. He was obnoxiously smart. The kind of guy who didn't just correct you, he made sure everyone in the room knew you'd been corrected. He'd roll up to public lectures and tear into accepted truths like he was roasting them on stage. One of his early moves? Demonstrating that Aristotle was flat out wrong about how fast objects fall. According to the ancients, heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. Galileo? He grabs 2 spheres, climbs the Leaning Tower of Pisa allegedly, drops them at the same time, and surprise, they hit the ground together. Cue gasps. Cue rage. Cue Galileo absolutely thriving in the drama. But he didn't stop there. He started publishing little mathematical treatises, some original, some clever riffs on Archimedes, and began drawing attention not just from the academic world, but from patrons with power. And in Renaissance Italy, patrons meant everything. You didn't get tenure. You got a nobleman who liked your work enough to fund your experiments and keep the church off your back. Galileo knew how to play that game. Mostly. By his early 20s, he landed teaching gigs in Florence and Padua and was already laying the groundwork for what would eventually become a war with the most powerful institution in the Western world, the Catholic Church. But at this point, he's still just a loud, brilliant professor who thinks he can rewrite the laws of nature if people would just stop being so wrong all the time. Galileo was not charming in the traditional sense. He was impatient, argumentative, and famously arrogant. But charisma? Oh, he had it. And in a world where ideas could literally get you burned at the stake, Galileo wasn't just thinking dangerous thoughts. He was daring people to stop him. By now, Galileo was a full-blown intellectual celebrity. His telescope had shown the world that Jupiter had moons. The Milky Way wasn't some decorative smear in the sky. And the moon? Not a perfect sphere. It had mountains, craters, imperfections. Suddenly, the heavens didn't look divine. They looked messy. And to the church, that was a problem. because messy meant mortal, and mortal meant not created perfectly by God. You can see why some bishops started sweating through their robes. But Galileo? He was thriving. He was writing faster than the censors could catch up. And not in dry, academic Latin either. He switched to Italian, the language of the people. Big move. Huge. Most scientists clung to Latin like a life raft, keeping their work safely locked away from the average peasant or merchant. Galileo, on the other hand, wanted to go viral. He wanted his ideas in salons, in taverns, in the back alleys of Rome and Venice. He wanted people talking. His writing wasn't polite either. It was sassy, sharp. He didn't just present facts. He mocked the people who still believed the Earth stood still. He didn't just argue for heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth orbits the Sun. He made anyone who doubted it look like a medieval clown. His pen had teeth, and he aimed it squarely at his opponents. By 1616, Galileo had thrown his lot in with Copernicus, publicly. And that's where things got nuclear. The Church, under Pope Paul V, officially banned Copernican theory that same year. Galileo was given a warning. Fine to speculate, fine to teach math, but don't go around saying the Earth actually moves. Don't state it as a fact. The word was out. Galileo had reached the danger zone. But Galileo? He had a side hustle, science as theater. He wasn't just an academic anymore. He was a performer, a provocateur, the kind of public intellectual who could make planetary motion feel like a political rebellion. His books were conversations, actual dialogues between characters with names like Simplicio. Guess which side the fool takes. They read like drama because they were drama. Science wasn't just knowledge to Galileo. It was a weapon, and he wielded it with the flair of a Renaissance rock star. And then, like fate had a wicked sense of humor, the papal throne passed to Pope Urban VIII, Galileo's old friend. For a moment, it looked like the tide was turning. Urban was no slouch. Intellectual, clever, well-read. He even admired Galileo's work. The stars were aligning. Galileo saw his chance and made a gamble that would eventually cost him everything. He wrote dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, a masterwork of science and shade disguised as an innocent conversation. Three men talk across 4 days. One argues for the old geocentric view, one for the new Copernican model, and one, Simplicio, bumblingly parrots the worst, weakest arguments for an Earth-centered universe. Sounds entertaining, right? It was. And it sold like wildfire. But here's the twist. Simplicio's lines were eerily similar to arguments made by Pope Urban VIII. Awkward. Whether it was intentional or a catastrophic misread of court politics, Galileo had done something unthinkable. He embarrassed the Pope. In print, in the vernacular, across Europe, it was intellectual betrayal dressed as polite dialogue. And no amount of, oh, Simplicio wasn't that Simplicio could fix it. The reaction was swift and brutal. The Church, which had tolerated Galileo's clever wordplay and subtle undermining, suddenly stopped laughing. Urban, once a fan, now felt personally attacked. The flirtation with controversy had turned into a full-blown affair with heresy. Galileo had overplayed his hand. The people adored him, the scholars debated him, but the Pope wanted answers. And not over wine and cheese. Over trial. In Rome. Under threat of torture. In front of the Inquisition. He wasn't just publishing theories anymore. He was leading a rebellion with footnotes. Galileo, the man who had once merely watched the heavens, was now being dragged into the fire of earthbound politics, dogma, and revenge. And the Church wasn't just coming for his book. They were coming for his soul. By 1632, Galileo had gone from respected scientist to celebrity heretic, a living lightning rod for one of the most dangerous debates in European history. The ink on dialogue concerning the two chief world systems had barely dried before word reached Rome that something was very, very wrong. Because this wasn't just a book about planets. It was a book that openly mocked church-approved cosmology and, even worse, made a fool out of Pope Urban VIII. Now, Urban wasn't just some stuffy bureaucrat in a tall hat. He was a politically savvy, image-obsessed power player who believed deeply in the church's authority, and even more deeply in his own. So when he realized that the voice of Simplicio, the book's most dim-witted character, sounded suspiciously like his own previously stated arguments, the mood shifted from indulgent to furious. Galileo had overstepped. Again. But this time, he wasn't getting a warning. This time, he was getting called to Rome during a plague outbreak, no less, to face the Roman Inquisition. Yes, that Inquisition. The same one that famously wasn't known for its chill. It was 1633. Galileo was 69 years old, suffering from arthritis, kidney stones, and chronic insomnia, and suddenly he found himself under formal investigation for vehement suspicion of heresy, a charge that, depending on how the winds blew, could end in anything from forced silence to execution. Let's be very clear. The Inquisition didn't play around. The interrogation chambers were designed not just to extract confessions, but to break men. They had every weapon imaginable, from psychological games to physical torture. Galileo was threatened with the rack, the most infamous method of dislocating a human body until it resembled wet laundry. It's likely they didn't actually use it on him. His reputation and age gave him some protection, but the threat alone was enough. For weeks, they grilled him, over and over. They asked whether he believed the earth moved, whether he had violated the 1616 warning not to promote Copernican theory, whether he had tricked the censors. At first, he tried the "I didn't mean it like that" approach. He insisted dialogue was hypothetical, satirical, a thought experiment, not a declaration. He even threw himself at the mercy of the church, groveling that he was confused, misled, mistaken. But they weren't buying it. The evidence was too clear. He had written it. He had published it. He had profited from it. And worst of all, people believed it. This wasn't just a defiant old man. This was a man whose ideas were catching on. And then came the day the church wanted to immortalize. June 22nd, 1633. That morning, in the convent of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, Galileo was brought into a dimly lit room, flanked by judges in black robes. With no lawyer, no defense, and no appeal, he was forced to kneel and speak the words that would haunt science for centuries. I, Galileo Galilei, with sincere heart and unfeigned faith, abjure, curse, and detest the said errors and heresies. He recanted, publicly, completely. He renounced the very ideas he'd spent his life proving. It was humiliation, broadcast across the continent. A warning, a spectacle. Legend says that as he stood up, physically broken, mentally crushed, he muttered under his breath, "E per esse move." And yet it moves. Did he really say it? No one can prove it. There's no record in the official documents. But the story stuck because it felt true. Because it was the ultimate mic drop from a man forced to bow under pressure, but never truly defeated. The church sentenced him to house arrest for the rest of his life. Not exile, not prison, a gilded cage, disguised as mercy. He was confined to his villa in Arcetri near Florence, cut off from public life, forbidden from publishing anything remotely controversial ever again. A scientific superstar, silenced in slow motion. But here's the twist. Galileo was never really silent. Even under house arrest, even going blind, even old and frail, he kept writing. His final masterpiece, Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations Relating to Two New Sciences, was smuggled out and published in Holland. It laid the groundwork for classical physics and later inspired the likes of Newton. It was his quiet revenge, precise, brilliant, unstoppable. Galileo's trial didn't destroy science. It crowned him its martyr. It became a symbol, a warning of what happens when dogma crushes curiosity, and a rallying cry for every rebel thinker who came after. He died in 1642, still under house arrest, but already immortal in the eyes of the scientific world. And the church? It would take them 359 years to formally admit that they were wrong. The official story should have ended with Galileo fading quietly into disgrace, an old man, broken by the church, trapped in his villa outside Florence, muttering equations to himself as the world moved on. But if Galileo Galilei was good at one thing, it was defying endings. After his 1633 trial, the church tried to press delete on him. They put him under permanent house arrest, banned dialogue, banned his telescope work, and for good measure, labeled him vehemently suspected of heresy, which was basically the Renaissance version of getting demonetized, deplatformed, and shadow banned in one go. They even buried his reputation under layers of theological red tape, hoping his influence would decay with his body. But that's not what happened. Galileo, now in his 70s, started going blind, likely from cataracts, possibly worsened by hours staring through crude telescopic lenses in his youth. The man who once mapped the craters of the moon could no longer see his own hands. But that didn't stop him, because Galileo didn't just look at the world, he understood how it moved. And he still had unfinished business. So, from the confines of his villa in Arcetri, he wrote what would become his final and most important scientific work, discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to two new sciences. It was the culmination of 30 years of thought. Ideas on motion, strength of materials, inertia, the very physics that Newton would later take, polish, and use to build the foundation of modern science. It was Galileo's quiet act of rebellion. No flashy titles, no characters like Simplicio, just math, logic, and raw truth. It was published illegally, smuggled out of Italy, and printed in the more liberal Dutch Republic, where the church's reach was shorter. It was a scientific jailbreak. And let's not ignore the subtext. Even under house arrest, even legally gagged, Galileo was still shaping the future of physics. Meanwhile, the church tried to ignore the fact that his ideas were leaking everywhere. Underground scholars were circulating his banned books. His students, fiercely loyal, were spreading his findings across Europe like intellectual contraband. Everyone from Descartes to Kepler to Newton had Galileo's fingerprints on their work. He had become the father of a movement that couldn't be silenced, the scientific revolution. And then came his death, January 8, 1642. He died at 77, confined to a single house, half-blind and fully excommunicated from scientific respectability in the eyes of Rome. The church wouldn't even allow him to be buried in the main body of the Basilica of Santa Croce, where the great minds of Florence were honored. He was shoved into a small side chapel, hidden from the public, like a shameful secret. But Galileo didn't stay buried for long. In 1737, almost a century later, the winds changed. The Enlightenment was in full swing, and suddenly Galileo was back in fashion. His remains were moved to a monumental tomb in the center of Santa Croce, right next to Michelangelo and Machiavelli. The guy who had been silenced, condemned, and sidelined, now immortalized in marble. Even better, get this, during the reburial, someone stole parts of his body. Literally. Fingers. Teeth. A vertebra. They were turned into relics by fans who viewed him not as a heretic, but as a secular saint of science. Today, one of his middle fingers is on display in a glass case in Florence, pointing forever at the sky, or maybe at the Vatican. But the most surreal twist of all came in 1992. That's right, 1992, not 1692. That year, after 359 years, the Vatican finally admitted it had made a mistake. Pope John Paul II declared that Galileo had been right all along. The Earth does, in fact, orbit the Sun. Who knew? He called the whole affair a tragic mutual misunderstanding, which is a hell of a way to describe nearly 4 centuries of censorship, threats, and forced recantation. But Galileo never needed the Church's forgiveness. His legacy had long since escaped their grasp. His name became shorthand for speaking truth to power, for daring to look through the lens, see the evidence, and say, "This is what I see, whether you like it or not." Today, Galileo is everywhere. Craters on the moon named after him, spacecraft bearing his name, statues in universities, schools across the world teaching his laws of motion to bored teenagers who have no idea they're repeating the words of a man once nearly broken by the Inquisition. He didn't just launch science forward, he launched the idea that evidence beats authority, that you don't need a crown or a collar or an army of theologians behind you to be right. You just need a telescope, a pen, and the guts to use them.